corners of a forgotten town, there stood an old, decaying workshop, untouched for years. The kind of place that no one dared enter, where time seemed to stop, and whispers of dark secrets hung in the air. They said the dollmaker who once lived there was a genius, crafting dolls so lifelike they could almost breathe. But there were darker whispers too, rumors of children who vanished, never to be seen again. When Ryan and Lucy moved into the old workshop that chilly October night, they had no idea of the horrors that awaited them. With their young daughter Emma, they hoped to start fresh in the quiet town, far from the noise and stress of the city. The house was old, but it had a certain charm, and the rent was cheap, too cheap. On their first night, the house groaned and creaked as the wind howled outside. Emma, ever curious, explored every corner of the workshop, marveling at the strange old tools left behind by the previous owner. She found an old, locked door in the back, and when she asked about it, her parents brushed it off, promising to check it later. But as night fell and the cold October air chilled the house, something began to stir. Emma woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of faint whispers. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as she listened closer, the voices became clearer, more insistent. They were calling her name. Soft, childlike voices begging her for help. She sat up, her heart racing, and glanced toward the foot of her bed. There, sitting in a perfect line, were 5 dolls she had never seen before. Their eyes, glassy and cold, seemed to be watching her. Terrified, she ran to her parents' room, but when Ryan and Lucy checked her room, the dolls were gone. They assured her it was just a nightmare, but deep down, Emma knew it was more than that. The next day, she avoided her room, sticking close to her parents as they unpacked. As the days passed, the strange occurrences grew worse. Lucy noticed old, handmade dolls appearing throughout the house. At first, she thought they were just toys Emma had found while exploring, but the more she looked at them, the more unsettled she became. The dolls' faces seemed too realistic, almost as if they were frozen in time, their expressions a mix of fear and sadness. One evening, while Lucy was cleaning the dusty shelves in the workshop, she found a diary hidden behind a stack of old books. The faded, worn cover was engraved with a name she didn't recognize, Anton the Dollmaker. She opened it, flipping through pages of meticulous notes about his creations. But as she read further, the notes became darker, more frantic. Anton wrote about a curse. He spoke of a time when his work had been praised, when people traveled for miles around to buy his dolls. But something had changed. His dolls were no longer lifeless toys, they were vessels. He had found a way to trap souls within them, and the children he used were never able to escape. Lucy's blood ran cold as she read the final entry. The dollmaker had been driven mad, consumed by his own twisted genius. He feared the souls of the trapped children would one day seek revenge. That night, as Ryan, Lucy, and Emma sat down for dinner, the house felt colder than usual. Emma was quiet, barely touching her food, her eyes distant. When Lucy asked her what was wrong, Emma simply said, "The dolls are scared. They want me to help them." Ryan tried to laugh it off, telling Emma she was just imagining things, but there was an unease in his voice. They had both felt it. Something wasn't right in the house. Later that evening, as the family sat together in the living room, a loud crash echoed through the house. It came from the locked door in the back of the workshop. Ryan grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate. The door, which had been locked for years, was now slightly ajar. Hesitantly, he pushed it open, revealing a small, dusty room filled with dozens of dolls. Their lifeless eyes stared back at him from every shelf, every corner. and in the center of the room, on a small wooden chair, sat a single doll, larger than the others, with a hauntingly familiar face. It looked just like Emma. Ryan staggered back, his heart pounding. He slammed the door shut and rushed back to the living room, but the sight that greeted him froze him in his tracks. Emma was standing in the center of the room, surrounded by the dolls that had been scattered throughout the house. They were all looking at her, their tiny hands raised, as if reaching for her. "They need me," Emma whispered, her voice hollow. "They're trapped." Before Ryan or Lucy could react, the lights flickered and the temperature in the room plummeted. The dolls began to move on their own, their heads turning, eyes blinking, mouths opening as if to speak. The air was filled with soft, childlike whispers, growing louder and louder until they were deafening. Ryan grabbed Emma, pulling her away from the circle of dolls, but she fought against him, tears streaming down her face. "We have to help them," she cried. Lucy, trembling, grabbed the diary and flipped to the last page. The only way to break the curse was to destroy the original doll, the one that had started it all, the one that looked just like Emma. They rushed back to the small room in the workshop, but as soon as they entered, the door slammed shut behind them. The dollmaker's ghostly presence filled the room, his twisted laughter echoing through the walls. "You cannot free them. They belong to me." Ryan grabbed the doll that resembled Emma and raised it above his head, ready to smash it against the ground. But the moment he did, the room was plunged into darkness. The dolls began to move, their small hands grabbing at his legs, pulling him down. Lucy screamed, grabbing Emma and trying to escape, but the door wouldn't budge. The dolls were everywhere now, crawling up the walls, their whispers turning to screams. Ryan, struggling to free himself, brought the doll crashing down onto the floor. The sound of shattering porcelain echoed through the room. And then silence. The dolls froze. The air grew still. Ryan, Lucy, and Emma stood in the darkness, their breaths shallow, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the room remained quiet. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and the cold presence that had filled the house seemed to lift. The dolls, now lifeless once again, lay scattered on the floor. Without a word, the family gathered their things and left the house. They never looked back. But as they drove away, Emma glanced out the window. Standing in the doorway of the old workshop was a figure, a doll, staring after them with cold, glassy eyes. There are certain things in this world that are better left forgotten. Objects with dark histories, shrouded in mystery, that have claimed more lives and souls than any would ever know. Yet, people are curious creatures, drawn to the forbidden, the dangerous. One such object was an ancient mirror, rumored to hold a connection to something far more sinister than anyone dared to imagine. Hazel had never believed in curses. She was the type of person who scoffed at superstitions and laughed at ghost stories. So when she stumbled across the dusty old mirror in an antique shop just before Halloween, she couldn't resist. The owner of the shop warned her about the mirror, claiming it was cursed and had been locked away for decades. But Hazel found the story ridiculous. A haunted mirror. It was perfect for her Halloween party. It wasn't just a mirror. Its frame was dark, nearly black, carved with intricate symbols and faces twisted in torment. The glass itself seemed almost too perfect, too clear, like it was hiding something just beneath the surface. Ignoring the shop owner's pleas to leave it alone, Hazel bought the mirror, amused by how such a simple object could come with such a wild legend. The night of the Halloween party, Hazel proudly displayed the mirror in her living room. Friends admired it, laughing and taking turns making silly faces in its reflection. Everyone joked about seeing the devil, but none of them took it seriously. The mirror was just that, a mirror. Or so it seemed. After the party ended and everyone left, Hazel stood alone in front of the mirror. She was slightly tipsy, laughing to herself as she gazed at her reflection. But as she looked closer, her laughter faded. The reflection seemed off. Her eyes, normally a soft hazel color, seemed darker, almost black. Her skin appeared paler, her expression twisted into something unfamiliar. Hazel blinked, rubbing her eyes, but the reflection didn't change. Goosebumps rose on her arms as she stepped back from the mirror. Maybe it was just the alcohol, she thought. Shaking off the unease, she went to bed, leaving the mirror standing ominously in the darkened living room. The next night, as Hazel walked past the mirror, she couldn't help but glance into it again. This time, the reflection showed her with a wicked grin, one that stretched far beyond what was humanly possible. The figure in the mirror leaned forward, its eyes narrowing with malice, and for a split second, Hazel thought she saw sharp, pointed teeth peeking through her lips. She jumped back, her heart racing. The reflection returned to normal in an instant, but the lingering fear didn't fade. Hazel stared at the mirror, trying to rationalize what she had seen. It was just her mind playing tricks on her. It had to be. Over the next few days, the reflection grew worse. Each time she passed the mirror, she saw her face becoming more grotesque. Her eyes blackened entirely, the skin grew rough, and horns seemed to sprout from her head. The figure in the reflection no longer moved in sync with her. Instead, it watched her, its lips curling into a mocking smile as it waited for something. Hazel started avoiding the mirror altogether. But no matter where she went in the house, she could feel its presence. She heard faint whispers at night, growing louder as the days passed. They called to her, promising power, beauty, and immortality. But there was a darker edge to the voices, one that filled her with dread. Desperate, she covered the mirror with a sheet, hoping that out of sight would mean out of mind. But the whispers continued, more insistent than before. They echoed through her dreams, haunting her until she could no longer sleep. One night, unable to take it any longer, Hazel ripped the sheet off the mirror. Her reflection was waiting for her. This time, it was fully transformed. Her once soft features were replaced by something monstrous. Her eyes glowed red, her skin was ashen, and her teeth were sharp, jagged, and far too many. The figure reached out, pressing its hand against the inside of the glass as if trying to break free. Hazel screamed, stumbling back, but she couldn't look away. The reflection spoke, its voice low and menacing. "You invited me. Now you can't get rid of me." Terrified, Hazel grabbed a hammer from the kitchen drawer and swung it at the mirror. But the glass didn't shatter. Instead, the impact reverberated back, knocking her to the ground. The figure inside laughed, a deep guttural sound that chilled Hazel to the bone. "You can't break what's already yours." Hazel tried to run, but the room twisted around her. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew heavy with the scent of sulfur. The mirror's reflection followed her, no matter where she turned. The voice taunted her, mocking her every move. It was no longer just a reflection. It was alive. In her desperation, Hazel remembered the shopkeeper's warning. He had mentioned something about breaking the curse, about an ancient ritual. But the details were fuzzy. She frantically searched for the business card he had given her, hoping for some way out. The phone rang, breaking the oppressive silence. Hazel answered it, her hands trembling. It was the shopkeeper. His voice was panicked, rushed. "You have to destroy it," he said, "before it's too late." "But how?" Hazel cried, tears streaming down her face. "I tried smashing it. It won't break." The shopkeeper's voice lowered. "You can't break the glass. You have to destroy the reflection." Hazel didn't understand. How could she destroy something that wasn't real? But she didn't have time to question it. The figure in the mirror was now pounding against the glass, cracks spreading across the surface. The devil was trying to break through. With no other option, Hazel grabbed a knife and stood in front of the mirror. She stared at the reflection, which had now fully taken on the form of the devil. Its horns were long and twisted, its eyes glowing with an unholy fire. It smiled at her, a smile that promised endless torment. Hazel raised the knife, her hands shaking. "I won't let you take me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The reflection laughed, but Hazel didn't hesitate. She plunged the knife into the glass. The room exploded with light, blinding her. For a moment, she thought she had done it. But when the light faded, she found herself standing in the same room. Only this time, something was different. She looked down at her hands. They were no longer her own. Her fingers were long, clawed, and covered in a dark, leathery skin. Her reflection was gone from the mirror. Instead, she was inside it. Hazel screamed, banging her hands against the glass, but it was too late. The devil had won. He had taken her place, leaving her trapped in the cursed mirror for eternity. And now she waited, just as the devil had waited before her, for the next curious soul to look into the mirror. The change in temperature came slowly at first, so subtle that she barely noticed. It was mid-October and cold was expected, but this chill was different. It was the kind that seeped into her bones, the kind that lingered long after she turned up the heat in the house. At first, she brushed it off, thinking her old furnace was struggling with the dropping temperatures. But the strange part was, the cold seemed to follow her, no matter where she went. Her name was Clara, and she had just moved into her new home a month ago. It was an old house, but charming in its own way, with creaky floors and windows that let in too much wind. She liked its character, its history. But as the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Clara began to feel something more sinister in the air. It started with her breath. She noticed it one night while sitting in the living room, curled up under a blanket with a book. The fire crackled in the fireplace, warmth radiating from the flames, but when Clara exhaled, she saw the unmistakable puff of white breath. Confused, she pulled the blanket tighter and glanced at the thermostat. It read a comfortable 70 degrees. Yet she could see her breath. She ignored it at first, chalking it up to her imagination. But the next morning, it happened again. Clara stepped out of the shower, her body wrapped in a towel, the bathroom still steamy from the heat, and there, hanging in the air, was her breath. A plume of cold mist, despite the warmth surrounding her. That's when the cold spots started. She'd walk through the house and suddenly feel an icy chill, like she'd stepped into a freezer. It wasn't constant, but it was enough to unsettle her. One night, As she was getting ready for bed, the temperature in her bedroom plummeted. The air felt thick with frost, her skin prickling from the sudden drop. Clara shivered and grabbed an extra blanket, hoping it was just a draft from the old windows. But then came the voices. At first, they were barely audible, whispers that seemed to drift through the walls. Clara thought it was her imagination, the wind playing tricks on her, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They didn't form words, not exactly, but she could sense the presence behind them. Something was in her house. Something cold, and it wasn't just the temperature. One night, unable to sleep, Clara lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was freezing despite the thermostat being cranked to its highest setting. That's when she heard it. A voice, soft and raspy, right beside her ear. "Help me." Clara bolted upright, her heart pounding in her chest. Her breath came in quick, icy clouds, as if the air itself was alive with cold. She scanned the room, but there was nothing there. Only the cold. Panicking, Clara grabbed her phone and dialed her best friend Lucy. She explained what was happening, the breath, the cold, the voices. Lucy tried to reassure her, saying it was probably just the old house and her overactive imagination. But Clara knew better. Something was wrong. As Halloween approached, the cold grew worse. Clara's entire house felt like a refrigerator. She tried everything, space heaters, extra blankets, but nothing worked. The cold was unnatural, unrelenting. It was as if the house itself was trying to freeze her out. One night, desperate for answers, Clara decided to do some research on the house's history. What she found made her blood run cold. Decades ago, a young woman had lived in the house alone. She had died one winter night, frozen to death in her own home. The heating had malfunctioned, trapping her in a deadly chill. But the strange part was, her body was found in the warmest part of the house, yet she had died from exposure. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the spirit of the young woman was still here. The cold wasn't just a coincidence, it was her. And she was getting stronger. That night, as the wind howled outside, Clara could feel the temperature dropping to unbearable levels. The house felt alive, groaning and creaking, as if it were breathing the cold air. She could hear the whispers again, louder now. "Help me. Free me." They echoed through the rooms surrounding her. Clara knew she had to do something. But what? How do you stop something you can't see, something that's already dead? Desperate, she tried talking to the spirit, her breath visible in the freezing air. She asked it what it wanted, pleaded for it to leave her in peace. But the cold only intensified, the voices growing more frantic. She was losing the battle. Her body was shutting down from the cold. Clara's vision blurred as she stumbled through the house, her limbs numb. It was as if the spirit was draining her, freezing her soul from the inside. Just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the cold shifted. The whispers turned to screams, and the temperature in the house plummeted to its lowest point. Clara collapsed to the floor, her breath coming out in ragged, icy gasps. But then silence. The cold began to fade. Slowly, the warmth returned. The house creaked, settling back into its normal state. Clara lay on the floor, shivering but alive. The spirit was gone. From now. Clara knew it would come back. It was only a matter of time before the cold returned, before the spirit once again tried to claim her soul. Halloween was only days away, and she could feel it. The ice-cold breath. If you want to hear more spine-chilling tales and experience the next heart-stopping horror, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You never know when the next story will come creeping into your mind. Stay tuned if you dare, because the darkness has only just begun.